Could Jesus' disciples read and write? In assessing if they wrote the Gospels and epistles attributed to them, this question is very important. Critics claim first-century Jews were illiterate, and thus the Jewish disciples of Jesus could not have written the Gospels. In fact, Robert Price asserts Acts 4:13 actually teaches the disciples Peter and John were illiterate. The text says, "Now when they saw the boldness of Peter and John, and perceived that they were agrammatoi and idiotoi, they marveled, and they took knowledge of them, that they had been with Jesus." But here Price is guilty of committing the false assumption about technical meaning fallacy. When this exegetical fallacy is committed, as Carson notes, quote, "An interpreter falsely thinks that a word always or nearly always has a certain technical meaning," end quote. Ehrman has also committed the same mistake concerning this verse. The problem is Acts 4:13, its use of agrammatoi should not be understood in this strict technical sense. Obviously, from a small conversation, these Jewish leaders would not be able to discern if Peter and John could read and write. That makes no sense. Instead, what was being said was that Peter and John were not formally apprenticed by a rabbi in Jewish law, scripture interpretation, and legal opinions. That, on the other hand, could be discerned by a theological conversation. The Jewish leaders referred to lack of advanced study under a Jewish scholar, and also to lack of secondary Jewish education. In first-century Palestine, Jews were first educated in their homes by learning Torah and literacy. Then they often went to primary school in a synagogue, memorizing Torah and reciting liturgy. This school was known as a Beth Sefer, house of reading, or house of the scribe. Afterwards, some went to secondary school at a Beth Midrash or Beth Talmud to learn rabbinic commentary on scripture, that is Midrash, or topically arranged oral law, that is Mishnah. After this, some were then formally apprenticed by a Jewish scholar in exegesis and legal opinion for advanced studies aimed at training future religious leaders. That agrammatoi has a broader semantic range than is assumed by Price and Ehrman can be seen in the fact that the Greek philosopher Epictetus talked about men who were agrammatoi still nevertheless being able to write. And Plato employed the word with a broader meaning of lack of general education. In light of the aforementioned considerations, most lexicographers and New Testament scholars who address the issue cast doubt on the interpretation of Price and Ehrman here, and note that Acts 4:13 just refers to being unversed in Jewish schools or education. For example, Thayer, Lowenita's lexicon, William Mounce's dictionary, Longnecker, Peterson, Bruce, Robert A. Wall, Witherington, Keener, Bach, Evans, etc. In sum, the Greek terms in Acts 4:13 were not employed to indicate Peter and John couldn't read or write. Therefore, it can't be used as evidence the disciples could not have wrote the Gospels. The dynamic equivalence NLT translation therefore has a great rendering, quote, "They could see that they were ordinary men with no special training in the scriptures," end quote. As regards early Jewish education and its bearing on literacy, Josephus informs us that parents taught children both the letters and the Torah in Against Apion 2:204. Here, agrammata is being used in the strict technical sense of letters, that is, literacy. It is not being used in the broader sense of learning. We know this because such learning in Jewish education context would be the learning of the law. Yet the learning of the law is also mentioned in the same sentence as a different aspect of education. Hence, to avoid redundancy, we must interpret Josephus as saying children were taught both letters, that is, literacy, as well as the theological content of the Torah. This Josephus evidence is crucial. This is also confirmed by another important Jewish work from the late Second Temple period called the Testament of Levi, which exhorts Jewish parents to, quote, "teach your children letters, that they may have understanding all their life, reading unceasingly the law of God," end quote. Testament of Levi 13:2. What is more, 4th Maccabees 18:9-19 indicates average Jewish men were able to read the law and the prophets to their children. In the Mishnah, the first century Rabbi Akiba indicated it was common for storekeepers to write on ledgers as a way to keep track of credit borrowing. As regards Jesus, in synoptic tradition, he was said to read from an Isaiah scroll in Luke 4:17-20. What is more, as a tax collector, see Mark 2:14, Matthew 10:3, and Luke 5:27, Matthew required the skill of literacy. He needed education in accounting and literacy for managing his records. Tax collectors wrote notes on pinakes as part of their job, as well as receipts and registers. Peter and John were fishermen. See Mark 1:16 and 19, Matthew 4:18 and 21, Luke 5:2-4 and 10. This trade likewise required the ability to read and write. As businessmen, they had to deal with tax collectors, toll collectors, and business records. As a physician, see Colossians 4:14, the Muratorian Canon, the anti-Marcionite prologue to Luke. Luke had to study medical works during his education and write reports on injuries and deaths for law enforcement and slave owners. This was a common practice of ancient doctors. That Paul was a former Pharisee means he was literate. In texts like Mark 2:25-26, the Pharisees are asked, quote, "Have you not read?" End quote. Again, we have evidence ancient Jewish and Gentile disciples, including first century ones, took notes of their master's teaching. This, of course, demands literacy of young disciples of rabbis, which is what Paul was when he trained to be a Pharisee under Gamaliel. See Galatians 1:14, Philippians 3:5, and Acts 22:3. This applies to Jesus' original 12 disciples as well. Now, although Zechariah lived in the rural hill country of Judah, see Luke 1:39-40, concerning his son in Luke 1:63, he still nevertheless, quote, asked for a writing tablet and wrote, "His name is John," end quote. Mark 10:4 indicates it was common for men to be able to write divorce certificates in first century Palestine, and we have some examples of these ancient divorce certificates from the time. They were a somewhat lengthy paragraph long. The parable of the shrewd manager in Luke 16 is an early pre-Lucan L tradition. It shows it was normal to assume common debtors could read and write. See Luke 16:5-7. John 19:20 says many Jews read the Titulus inscription placed near Jesus' cross. The fact this inscription was even created for the masses assumes commoners in Jerusalem were expected to be able to read it. In fact, it was most likely a warning to actual and potential disciples of Jesus. See Mark 15:26, Matthew 27:37, and Luke 23:38. In the context of the Jerusalem Council, Acts 15:19 assumes early Jewish Christians could write letters. 2 Corinthians 3:14 states first century Jews read the Old Testament. In Acts 8:30-35, a Galilean disciple named Philip was able to read and interpret the Old Testament better than an educated Ethiopian. One final point, Brian J. Wright's recent work on ancient communal reading events also helps demonstrate that first century Jewish, Christian, and Greco-Roman literacy was very high. His book is called Communal Reading in the Time of Jesus. In fact, reviewers identify the work as seminal, and because of how groundbreaking it is, they even call for a paradigm shift or entire revision on the ideas about population literacy. Thanks for watching.